She was a saloon girl. He was the sheriff's new right hand. And on a Tuesday afternoon that looked like every other Tuesday afternoon, the doors swung open and their eyes met across the length of the bar. She looked away first. She had not done that in 6 years. She had worked the saloon long enough to know it the way she knew her own breathing. The scrape of a chair before a fight. The hush that dropped over a table when a hand turned bad. The kind of laugh a man gave when he had money and the kind he gave when he was working hard to hide that he didn't. Men were simple math. She had learned that early, and she had not been wrong about it since. It was a Tuesday. Carl Decker was beside her, talking in slow circles about his fence line, while she smiled at the right moments, the way she always did. The piano played its usual complaint. Dust on the windows, whiskey on the bar, the afternoon going the way afternoons went. Then the doors opened. She couldn't have said what made her look up. Some shift in the light, maybe some change in the weight of the room. He stood in the doorway with the road still on him, the particular stillness of a man who was in no hurry about anything and had nothing to prove about it. His eyes moved across the length of the bar, and then they found hers and they stopped. She looked away first. Her hand on the next bottle was not quite right. She set it down clean and went on working. Carl was still talking. The piano was still playing. The afternoon had not changed at all, but her hand had not been unsteady in 6 years. And she knew the difference between a thing that meant nothing and a thing that meant something. And she did not insult herself by pretending otherwise. His name reached her, the way names always reached her, through other people, sideways, women at the dry goods counter, dropping their voices to that particular register. That meant the conversation had stopped being about errands. Nathan Wells, the sheriff's new deputy. 2 weeks in town, and already those women were saying his name like something they wanted to hold carefully. Pearl had smiled at that. She had thought she understood. She had been wrong about that. It was a Thursday morning when they came through the doors. Not one man this time, but the sheriff and 4 deputies moving with the quiet of men who have already settled the question of how the morning will go. Nathan was among them. He did not look at her. She understood immediately that this was the kindest thing he could have done. The owner saw them and went the color of old ash behind the bar. Whatever had been happening in the curtained room at the back, and she had known for 2 years, had kept it pressed flat inside her, because her roof and her wages had depended on her not knowing, had finally run its course. The place was shut before noon. The owner was taken away. The piano sat silent for the first time she could remember, and the silence had a different quality than the usual kind. Heavier, with an edge to it that didn't soften when she stepped outside. She stood on the boardwalk with her bag at her feet. The street went about its business around her. A wagon passed. 2 men came out of the land office and went separate ways without looking at her. She stood there and did the math on her situation, and the math was bad. 6 years at a saloon that had just been raided by the law, her name attached to it the way a brand attaches, not something you set down. The boarding house on Elm had not let her finish her sentence. She had seen it in the woman's face before the door was fully open and had walked away cleanly, rather than stand there while it was said out loud. She did not perform anything. She kept her chin level and her hands loose, and she let the math be what it was. The light was going by the time she heard boots on the boardwalk behind her. There was something familiar in the unhurried step. She turned around. He looked at her bag on the ground, then at her face. He said he had a spare room. She could have it until she found something sorted. She looked down the street at the lamps coming on one by one in the early dark. The town will talk. He had heard that before about other things, and his expression said he had already accounted for it. I know it will. She looked at him. She had expected him to say it didn't matter, the way men said things like that before they discovered they did. He hadn't said that. He had said he knew, which meant he had looked at the full cost of coming down here and come anyway. She picked up her bag. He took it from her hand without asking, and they walked up the street in the early dark, and she kept her eyes forward and did not look at the amber light in the windows of the houses they passed. The room was small and faced the yard where his horse stood in the pen each evening. There was a quilt on the bed and a basin on the stand and a hook on the back of the door. She had been making enough do for a long time. She cooked because there was food, and she knew what to do with it. She ran his errands in the mornings because moving through town with a purpose was survivable in a way that moving through it without one was not. She cleaned because the house needed it and her hands needed something to do in the long hours between his leaving and his coming back. She felt the eyes. 2 women outside the milliner's went quiet, a half-beat too late as she passed. A man who had tipped his hat to her at the saloon for 3 years found something interesting on the other side of the street. She kept her pace and her face level and told herself she had survived worse versions of this and believed it most days. In the evenings, Nathan came home and she put supper on the table. And they talked. Not about important things at first. The horse, the weather. A complaint about the feed merchant's short measure that made her raise an eyebrow because she had thought the same thing for 2 years and never said so. He caught the expression. "You knew about that." She refilled his coffee before she answered. "Everyone knew. He's been doing it since '94. Nathan was quiet a moment, turning that over. Then he looked up at her. "What else does everyone know?" She set the pot back on the stove. "That depends on who you mean by everyone." He almost smiled. She caught the edge of it before he looked back down at his plate, and she went back to the stove and kept her hands busy and told herself it was the heat from the fire that she was feeling. About 10 days in, he mentioned a land dispute that had come across the sheriff's desk. Boundary claim, 2 competing surveys, no clean answer. He said it the way he said most things, not asking for anything directly, just turning it over out loud. She came to the table and leaned over the rough map he had sketched, close enough that her hand was near his on the page, and she pointed at the eastern line. She said the name of the man who had been paid to produce the second survey. Said, "It the way you say something you have known for a long time and have simply been waiting for the right place to put it." She told him the amount, the date, the names of the other 2 men at the table that night. She had been clearing glasses 3 feet away for the better part of an hour, and nobody had looked at her once. She glanced up to find him watching her, not the map. Her with that full, unhurried attention of his that didn't move when she caught it. She lost the next word entirely. Found it, finished the sentence, straightened up and went back to her side of the table, and did not look at him again for a moment. "I have 6 years of that," she said to the middle distance. "If it's useful." He leaned back in his chair. "Why didn't you take it to the sheriff yourself?" She looked at him then. Would he have listened? He thought about that honestly, which she appreciated. "Probably not," he said finally. She picked up her coffee. "There's your answer." 3 days later, Nathan brought the land office clerk to the kitchen table. Because the sheriff needed him certain, Pearl knew the clerk. He had been in the saloon 4 winters back, sitting quiet in the corner while 2 men worked out an arrangement involving a survey line and a number that was not the number on the public record. He had not participated. He had not left either. Nathan set a paper on the table and asked if she recognized the names on it. Pearl looked once. Then she told them the date, the amount, the drink that had been ordered, and the name of the man who had laughed when the money changed hands. She said it all to the clerk, not to Nathan, because the clerk was the one who needed to hear it said plainly by someone who had been in the room. The clerk stopped looking at Nathan. He looked at Pearl instead, not the way men usually looked at her, the way a man looks when he has just been forced to revise something he thought he understood. By the following morning, the alderman's back office that had stayed open for years was shut. The man, who had walked the main street like he owned the boards beneath him, started taking the alley home and did not stop. Nathan said nothing about it at supper that evening. He didn't need to. Pearl went on with the stove and the errands and the evenings, and she did not look too closely at what the days had become. It was a Friday morning when the women came to it directly. She was at the general store, flour, coffee, lamp oil. 3 of them near the counter when she came through the door. She knew all of them. She had served 2 of their husbands at the saloon and kept private what she had seen of those men, which was considerably more than either of them had earned from her. They let her reach the counter before one of them spoke. The voice carried the particular warmth of organized concern. A man in Nathan's position had a certain kind of future ahead of him in this county. The right foundation mattered for a man still establishing himself. She let that breathe, then said that some arrangements, however charitable in spirit, had a way of following a man, whether he intended it or not, that surely a woman of Pearl's background understood what she meant, without it needing to be laid out any further. Pearl set her list flat on the counter. She put both hands on the wood. She looked at the woman and held it, not with heat, not with anything that could be picked up and used against her, just with the steady patience of someone who has been talked around for 6 years and has not yet found a reason to look away. The warmth in the woman's face began to cost her something to maintain. Pearl bought her flour and her coffee and her lamp oil and walked out. She turned the corner and stood alone in the cold air just a moment. Then she went home and put the groceries away and started supper, and kept her hands moving until they felt like her own again. She hadn't planned to say anything about it. But Nathan came home that evening and looked at her once across the kitchen. Not a long look, just enough, and asked what had happened. She told him, flat, no weight on it, just the shape of it in plain words. He listened all the way to the end without interrupting. Then he pushed back from the table and stood. "I'll be back before supper." He was back in 40 minutes. He sat down and she put his plate in front of him, and when she set it down, his hand came over hers on the table. Just for a moment, warm and certain, and then gone. She went back to the stove, and neither of them said a word about it. She didn't sleep well that night. She didn't examine why. The next morning she passed all 3 women outside the church. Not one of them spoke. Not one of them found her eyes. She walked on and let it be what it was. It was maybe a week after that when she fell asleep in the chair by the hearth. She hadn't meant to. It had been a long day, and the fire was warm, and she had sat down just for a moment after supper, while he was at the table with some paperwork. When she opened her eyes, the room was quieter, and the fire had settled low, and there was a blanket over her that had not been there before. He was still at the table, reading something by the lamp, his face tilted toward the page. She watched him for a moment in the low light without meaning to, the set of his shoulders, the way he turned a page carefully, unhurried, the same way he did everything. The fire threw its light across the side of his face, and the room was very still, and she was warm in a way that had nothing to do with the blanket, and she knew it. He looked up. She looked at the fire. Her face was already warm, and the fire was not entirely responsible, and there was nothing she could do about that, except let it pass. He closed the papers on the table. "You should get some proper sleep." She pulled the blanket up around her shoulders. "I was sleeping in a chair." He said it without judgment, just as a plain fact about chairs. She kept her eyes on the fire. "I've slept in worse." He was quiet for a moment. When he spoke again, his voice was lower, careful not to break the quiet of the room. "I know you have." There was something in it. Not pity, nothing like that. Just the simple acknowledgement of a man who understood what her life had cost her, and didn't flinch from it. She pulled the blanket a little further up, and after a while she heard him bank the stove and cross the room, and his hand rested briefly on her shoulder as he passed. Just a moment, warm through the blanket. and then he was gone. And she sat in the quiet of the room for a long time before she followed. November came in cold and stayed that way. She had stopped looking for another situation without marking the moment it happened. The mornings had taken on a shape that was no longer temporary. The kitchen smelled the way a kitchen smells when it has been used the same way, long enough to hold it in the walls. She knew which board on the back step creaked and which window latch needed lifting before it would turn. And she knew his horse's sound in the yard before she could hear his boots on the path. She had also learned, without meaning to, exactly how long she could hold his gaze across the supper table, before her breath did something she hadn't given it permission to do. The answer was not very long. She was 26 years old and had spent 6 of those years learning to keep herself steady around men who didn't deserve the effort. She had not accounted for one who did. One evening, he came home later than usual. She put the coffee on, without thinking about it. She heard the horse in the yard and his boots on the step and the door the same as every evening, and she had the cup waiting when he came through. He sat at the table and was quiet in a way that was different from his usual quiet. She sat down across from him and the lamp was between them. And outside the wind had come up across the flat land, that dry November kind that didn't stop for anything. He looked at her directly, the way he always looked at her. She held it this time, just held it and felt what she always felt and let it show, just enough and didn't look away. "I'd like you to stay," he said. "Not the way things have been. Permanently, if you're willing." The stove ticked. Outside, the horse moved once in the pen and went still. She looked at this man who had come for her in the dark and taken her bag from her hand without asking, who had listened to 6 years of carefully kept information and treated every word of it as worth something, who had put a blanket over her while she slept and sat quietly in the same room and asked nothing back, who had covered her hand with his for one moment after the worst afternoon she'd had in months and then let go without making anything of it, who had brought a frightened clerk to her kitchen table and trusted her to be the one to make him understand, who did everything that way without performance, without needing it remarked on, because that was simply what kind of man he was. She had spent 6 years learning to want very little. She had gotten so practiced at the not wanting that she had stopped noticing what it cost her all that time. Day after quiet day, she reached across the table and put her hand over his. Deliberate, unhurried, she felt him go very still. "I was wondering," she said, "when you were going to get around to that." Something moved through his face. Not quite a smile. Close enough. "Yes," she said. "Obviously, yes." His hand turned under hers and held on and did not let go. They married on a Saturday in December. The church was cold enough that the minister's breath showed between the words. The town came, most of it. Some out of warmth, some out of wanting to see it with their own eyes. The sheriff sat near the front. The 3 women from the general store sat toward the back. That they came at all said something. Pearl received it without examining it too hard. Outside after, the cold came off the flat land in a steady push. Someone's dog crossed the street at a trot, occupied with its own business. 2 boys ran past arguing about something that would be resolved or forgotten before dark. The town went on around them the way towns go on, indifferent, familiar, entirely unchanged. Nathan put his hand at her back and they walked to the wagon. The road home ran straight through flat country, frost at the field edges, the sky going pale in the late afternoon. She could see the house from a long way off, low and solid against the open land, smoke from the chimney going straight up in the still air. The gray lifted his head in the pen when they turned in at the gate. She had come to that house with a bag and one offer, and nowhere else to go. She climbed down from the wagon and stood a moment in the cold and looked at it. The stove would need building up. There was supper to start. The lamp oil was low and she had forgotten to put it on the list. Nathan came to stand beside her. He looked at the house the same way she was looking at it. Not performing anything, just looking. The way a man looks at something he intends to take good care of for a long time. She had been managing her own breathing around this man for months. She didn't bother managing it now. She went inside, and he followed, and the door closed behind them both. And the smoke from the chimney went on rising, straight and steady into the cold December sky. And that was the story of how a saloon girl ended up with the sheriff's new right hand.